Well, good morning, my grandchildren. I forgot to delete the last the last reading, and didn't have enough memory on my phone to get it all done, so I've got to start over again. Well, if you remember, we're reading Charlotte's Web, and it's a story about Fern and her little pig that she named Wilbur, and we'll get to who Charlotte is later. But we finished with Fern sold Wilbur to her uncle, and her uncle, Mr. Zuckerman, now has Wilbur in a barn. And so I pick up our story there with chapter 3, The Escape. The barn was very large and was very old. It smelled of hay, and it smelled of manure, it smelled of the perspiration of tired horses, and the sweet breath of patient cows, and it often had that sort of, peaceful smell, as though nothing bad could ever happen again in the world. It smelled of grain, and it smelled of harnesses dressing, and it smelled of axle grease and rubber boots and new rope. And whenever the cat was given a fish head to eat, the barn smelled of fish. But mostly, it smelled of hay. There was always hay in the great loft up overhead, and there was always hay being pitched down to the cows and the horses and the sheep for them to eat. And the barn was pleasantly warm in the winter, and it was where the animals spent most of their time indoors in the wintertime, and it was pleasantly cool in the summer when the big doors were wide open to the breeze, and the barn had stalls on the main floor for the work horses and tie-ups on the main floor for the cows, and the sheepfold was down below for the sheep, and the pig pen was down below for Wilbur. And it was full of all sorts of things that you might find in barns, things like ladders and grindstones and pitchforks and monkey wrenches and scythes and lawnmowers and snow shovels and axe handles and milk pails and water buckets and empty grain sacks and rusty rat traps. It was the kind of barn that swallows like to make their nests in, and it was the kind of barn that children like to play in. And the whole thing was owned by Fern's uncle, Homer L. Zuckerman. Wilbur's new home was in the lower part of the barn, directly underneath the cows, and Mr. Zuckerman knew that a manure pile was a good place to keep a young pig. Pigs need warmth, and it was warm and comfortable down there in the barn cellar on the south side. Here's a picture of Wilbur eating at his trough. He's growing into a pretty big pig. Fern came almost every day to visit him, and she found an old milking stool that had been discarded, and she placed the stool in the sheepfold next to Wilbur's pen. Here she sat quietly during the long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. The sheep soon got to know her, and they trusted her. So did the geese, who lived with the sheep. And all the animals really trusted Fern. She was quiet and friendly, and Mr. Zuckerman did not allow her to take Wilbur out, and she did not allow her to get into the pig pen with Wilbur. But she told Fern that she could sit on the stool and watch Wilbur as long as she wanted to. It made her happy just to be near the pig. It made Wilbur happy, too, to know that she was sitting right there outside his pen, but he never had any fun. No walks, no rides, no swims. And one afternoon in June, Wilbur was almost 2 months old, and he wandered out into the small yard outside the barn. Fern had not arrived yet for her usual visit. Wilbur stood there. He was in the sun, feeling lonely and bored. There's never anything to do around here, he thought. He walked slowly to his food trough and sniffed to see if anything had been overlooked at lunch. He found a small strip of potato skin, and he ate that. His back itched, so he leaned against a fence and rubbed against the boards. When he got tired of this, he walked indoors and climbed up on top of the manure pile and sat down. He didn't feel like going to sleep. He didn't feel like digging. He was tired of standing still, and he was tired of laying down. I'm less than 2 months old, and I'm tired of living, thought Wilbur, and he walked out into the yard again. When I'm out here, he said, there's no place to go but in. And when I'm indoors, there's no place to go but out here in this yard. That's where you're wrong, that's where you're wrong, my friend, said a voice. Wilbur looked through the fence, and he saw the goose standing there. You don't have to stay in that dirty little yard, said the goose, who talked rather fast. One of the boards is loose, push on it, push on it, and push and come out. What? Said Wilbur. Say it slower. At the risk of repeating myself, said the goose, I suggest that you just come out. It's wonderful out here. Did you say a board was loose? I did. I said that, said the goose. Wilbur walked up to the fence and he saw that, in fact, the goose was right. One board was loose. He put his head down and he shut his eyes and he pushed, and the board gave way. And in a minute, he squeezed through the fence and was standing in the long grass outside of his yard. The goose clucked. How does it feel? How does it feel to be free? How does it feel? She asked. I like it, said Wilbur. That is, I guess I like it. Actually, Wilbur felt a little funny being outside of his fence with nothing between him and the great big world. Where do you think I'd better go? Asked Wilbur. Anywhere you like, said the goose. Go down to the orchard, root up the sod. Go down to the garden, dig up the radishes, root up everything, eat the grass. Look for corn, look for oats, run all over, skip and jump and dance and jump and prance and go down through the orchard and stroll through the woods. And the world is a wonderful place when you're young. Well, I can see that, said Wilbur. He gave a jump in the air and twirled and ran a few steps and stopped and looked all around and sniffed the smell of the afternoon and set off walking down through the orchard. Pausing just a little bit in the shade of the apple tree, he put his strong snout into the ground and he began to push. He was digging and rooting and he felt very happy. He had plowed up quite a piece of ground before anyone noticed him. Well, Mrs. Zuckerman was the first one to see him. She saw him from the kitchen window. She immediately shouted for the men. Homer, she cried, pigs out. Louvie, pigs out. Homer, Louvie, pigs out. He's down there under that apple tree. Down now. The trouble starts, thought Wilbur. Now I'll catch it. The goose heard the racket, and she too started hollering. Run downhill, make for the woods, she shouted to Wilbur. They'll never catch you in the woods. The Cocker Spaniel heard the commotion, and he ran out from the barn to join the chase, and Mr. Zuckerman heard from the machine shed where he was mending a tool. He joined the chase, and Louvie, the hired man, heard the noise and came up from the asparagus patch where he'd been pulling weeds, and everybody was walking towards Wilbur. And Wilbur didn't know what to do. The woods seemed a long way off, and anyway, he'd never been to the woods, and he wasn't sure he'd like it. Get around behind him, Louvie, said Mr. Zuckerman. Drive him toward the barn. Take it easy, don't rush him. I'll go get a bucket of slops. The news of Wilbur's escape spread rapidly among the animals on the place. Whenever anybody broke loose on Mr. Zuckerman's farm, the event was of great interest to all the others. The goose shouted to the nearest cow that Wilbur was free, and soon all the cows knew. And then one of the cows told one of the sheep, and soon all the sheep knew. The lambs learned about it from their mothers, and the horses in the stalls in the barn pricked up their ears when they heard the goose hollering, and soon the horses had caught on to what was going on, and Wilbur was out, they said. Every animal stirred and lifted its head and became very excited to know what one of his friends had gotten free and was no longer pinned up or tied down. Wilbur didn't know what to do. He didn't know which way to go. He didn't know where to run. It seemed as though everybody was after him. If this is what it's like to be free, thought Wilbur, I believe I'd rather just be in my own yard. The Cocker Spaniel was sneaking up on him from one side. Louvie, the hired man, was sneaking up on him from the other side. Mrs. Zuckerman stood ready to head him off if he started toward the garden, and now Mr. Zuckerman was coming towards him carrying a pail. This is really awful, thought Wilbur. Why doesn't Fern come? And he began to cry. There's Mr. and Mrs. Zuckerman coming. And there's Louvie catching the dog instead of the pig. He's going for the pig. The goose took command and began to give orders. Don't just stand there, Wilbur. Dodge about, cried the goose. Skip around, run towards me. Slip in and out. Make for the woods, twitch and run. The Cocker Spaniel sprang for Wilbur's hind leg, and Wilbur jumped and ran, and Louvie reached out and grabbed for Wilbur, and Mrs. Zuckerman screamed at Louvie, and the goose cheered for Wilbur, and Wilbur dodged between Louvie's legs, and Louvie missed, and Wilbur was grabbed the spaniel missed Wilbur and grabbed the spaniel instead. Nicely done, cried the goose. Try it again. Run downhill. Run towards me, yelled the gander. Run uphill, cried the sheep. Turn and twist, honked the goose. Jump and dance, said the rooster. Look out for Luffy, called the cows. Look out for Zuckerman, called the gander. Watch out for the dog, cried the sheep. Listen to me, screamed the goose. And poor Wilbur. Wilbur was dazed and he was frightened by all this hullabaloo, and he didn't like to be in the center of all this fuss. He tried to follow the instructions of his friends that they were giving him, but, well, he couldn't run downhill and uphill at the same time. And he couldn't turn and twist when he was jumping and dancing. And he was crying so much that he could hardly see and anything that was happening to him at all. And, well, after all, Wilbur was a young pig. Not much more than a baby, really, and he just wished that Fern were there to take him in her arms and comfort him. When he looked and he saw Mr. Zuckerman standing quite close to him, holding a pail of warm slops, he felt relieved. He lifted his nose and he sniffed it and he smelled, and the smell was delicious. Warm milk, potato skins, wheat middlings, Kellogg's corn flakes, a popover left over from Zuckerman's breakfast. Come, pig, said Mr. Zuckerman, tapping the pail. Come, pig. Wilbur took a step for the pail. No, cried the goose. No. It's the old pail trick, Wilbur. Don't fall for it. He's trying to lure you back to captivity. He's appealing to your stomach. Wilbur didn't care. The food smelled good. He took another step toward the pail. Pig. Come on, pig, said Mr. Zuckerman in a kind voice. He began walking slowly toward the barnyard, looking all about him innocently, as if he didn't really know that a little white pig was following along behind him. You'll be sorry, called the goose. Wilbur didn't care. He kept walking toward the pail of slops. You'll miss your freedom, honked the goose. And an hour of freedom is worth a barrel of slops. Wilbur just didn't care what the goose said anymore. When Mr. Zuckerman reached the pig pen, he climbed over the fence and poured the slops into the trough, and then he pulled the loose board away from the fence. There was a wide hole now for Wilbur to walk through. Reconsider, called the goose. Wilbur paid no attention. He stepped through the fence into his yard. He walked through and took a long drink of slops. Sucking the milk down hungrily and chewing on the popover, it was good to be home again. And while Wilbur ate, Luffy fetched a hammer and some 8-penny nails and nailed the board in place, and then he and Mr. Zuckerman leaned lazily on the fence, and Mr. Zuckerman scratched Wilbur's back with a stick. He's quite a pig, said Luffy. Yes, he'll make a good pig, said Mr. Zuckerman. Wilbur heard the words of praise, and he felt the warm milk inside his stomach, and he felt the pleasant rubbing of the stick along his itchy back, and he felt peaceful and happy and sleepy. This had been a tiring afternoon. It was still only about 4 o'clock, but Wilbur was ready for bed. I'm really too young to go out into the big world all alone, he thought, and he lay down and went to sleep. Well, the next day, it was rainy and it was dark. Rain fell on the roof of the barn and dripped steadily from the eaves, and rain fell in the barnyard, and rain was running now in crooked courses down into the lane where thistles and pigweed grew. Rain splattered against Mrs. Zuckerman's kitchen window and came gushing down out of the downspouts. Rain fell on the backs of the sheep as they gazed in the meadow, and when the sheep were tired of standing in the rain, they walked slowly up the lane and into the fold. Rain upset Wilbur's plans. Wilbur had planned to go out this day, dig a new hole in his yard. He had other plans too. His plans for the day went something like this. Breakfast at 6:30, skim milk crusts, middlings, bits of donuts, wheat cakes and drops of maple syrup sticking to them, potato skins left over, custard pudding, and with raisins and bits of shredded wheat. Breakfast would be finished at 7, and from 7 to 8, Wilbur planned to have a talk with Templeton. Templeton was the rat that lived under his trough. Talking with Templeton was not the most interesting occupation in the world, but it was better than nothing. From 8 to 9, Wilbur planned to take a nap outdoors in the sun. From 9 to 11, he planned to dig a hole or a trench or possibly find something good to eat buried in the dirt. From 11 to 12, he planned to stand still and watch the flies on the boards and watch the bees in the clover and watch the swallows in the air. And at 12 o'clock, it would be lunchtime. Middlings, warm water, apples, parings, meat gravy, carrot carrot scrapings, meat scraps, stale hominy, and the wrapper of a package of cheese, and lunch would be over at 1. From 1 to 2, Wilbur planned to sleep, and from 2 to 3, he planned to scratch his itchy places by rubbing against the fence, and from 3 to 4, he planned to stand perfectly still and to think of what it was just to be alive. And he was going to wait for Fern. And at 4 o'clock would come supper with skim milk and leftover sandwich from Larry Luby's lunchbox, and prune skins and morsels of this and bits of that, and fried potatoes and marmalade drippings and a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that, and a piece of baked apple and a scrap of upside down cake. Wilbur had gone to sleep thinking about all these plans, and he woke up at 6, and it was raining, and it seemed as though he just couldn't bear it. I get everything all beautifully planned out in my head, and it has to go and rain, he said. For a while he just stood gloomily indoors. Then he walked to the door and looked out. Drops of rain struck him in his face. His yard was cold and wet, and his trough had an inch of rainwater in it, and Templeton was nowhere to be seen. "Are you out there, Templeton?" called Wilbur. There was no answer. Suddenly Wilbur felt lonely and friendless. "One day just like another," he groaned. "I'm very young. I have no real friends here in the barn. It's going to rain all morning. It's going to rain all afternoon, and Fern won't come out in such bad weather. And honestly," he sighed. Wilbur was crying again, for the second time in 2 days. At 6:30, Wilbur heard a banging of a pail. Luby was standing outside in the rain, stirring up the breakfast. "Come on, pig," said Luby. Wilbur didn't budge. Luby dumped the slop, scraped the pail, and walked away. He noticed that something was wrong with the pig. Wilbur didn't want food. He wanted love. He wanted a friend, someone to play with him. He mentioned this to the goose, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the sheepfold. "Will you come over and play with me?" he asked. Sorry, said the goose. "I'm sitting on my eggs. 8 of them. Got to keep them toasty warm. I have to stay right here. I'm a flibberty gibberty. I do not play when there are eggs to hatch. I'm expecting goslings." "Well, I didn't think you were expecting woodpeckers," said Wilbur bitterly. Wilbur next tried one of the lambs. "Will you play with me?" he asked. "Certainly not," said the lamb. "In the first place, I cannot get into your pen, as I am not old enough to jump over the fence, and in the second place, I am not interested in pigs. Pigs mean less than nothing to me." "What do you mean, less than nothing?" replied Wilbur. "I don't think there is such a thing. I don't think there is anything less than nothing. Nothing is absolutely the limit of nothingness. It's the lowest you can go. It's the end of the line. How can something be less than nothing? If there were something that was less than nothing, then nothing would not be nothing. It would be something. Even though it would be just a very little bit of something, it would be something. But if it's something, if it's nothing, if nothing is nothing, then nothing has to be the least that there can be. There is nothing less than what it is." "Oh, be quiet," said the lamb. "Go play by yourself. I don't play with pigs." Sadly, Wilbur lay down and listened to the rain. Soon he saw the rat climbing down the slanting board that he used as a stairway. "Will you play with me, Templeton?" asked Wilbur. "Play?" said Templeton, twirling his whiskers. "Play? I hardly know the meaning of the word play." "Well," said Wilbur, "it means to have fun, to frolic, to run, to skip about, and to make merry." "I never do those things if I can avoid them," replied the rat sourly. "I prefer to spend my time eating, gnawing, spying, and hiding. I'm a glutton, but I'm not a merrymaker." Here's a picture of the lamb walking off, all got her nose up in the air, and Wilbur hasn't got any takers. Templeton said, "Right now I'm on my way to the trough to eat your breakfast, since you haven't got good enough sense to eat it yourself." And Templeton the rat crept stealthily along the wall and disappeared into the private tunnel that he had dug between the door and the trough in Wilbur's yard. Templeton was a crafty rat, and he had things pretty much his own way. The tunnel was an example of his skill and his cunning. The tunnel enabled him to get from the barn to his hiding place under the pig trough without ever coming out into the open. He had tunnels and runways all over Mr. Zuckerman's farm, and he could get from one place to another without really being seen. Usually, he slept during the daytime and was abroad only after dark. Wilbur watched him disappear into his tunnel, and in a moment he saw the rat's sharp nose poke up out from underneath the wooden trough. Cautiously, Templeton pulled himself over the edge of the trough. This was almost more than Wilbur could stand, and on this dreary, rainy day, to see his breakfast being eaten by somebody else. He knew Templeton was getting soaked out there in the pouring rain, but even that didn't comfort him. Friendless and dejected and hungry, he threw himself down on his manure pile and he just sobbed. Late that afternoon, Louvie went to Mr. Zuckerman. "I think there's something wrong with that pig of yours. He hasn't even touched his food." "Give him 2 spoonfuls of sulfur and a little molasses," said Mr. Zuckerman. "That'll help." Wilbur couldn't believe what was happening to him when Louvie caught him and forced the medicine down his throat. This was certainly the worst day of his life. He didn't know whether he could endure the awful loneliness anymore. Here's a picture of Wilbur, sitting there all dejected and all worried. Darkness settled over everything, and soon there were only shadows and the noises of the sheep chewing their cuds and occasionally a rattle of a cow chain up overhead. You can imagine Wilbur's surprise when out of the darkness came a small voice that he had never heard before. It sounded rather thin, but it was pleasant. "Do you want a friend, Wilbur?" it said. "I'll be a friend to you. I've watched you all day long, and I kind of like you." "But I can't see you," said Wilbur, jumping to his feet. "Where are you? Who are you?" "I'm right up here," said the voice. "Now go to sleep. You'll see me in the morning." And that's the end of chapter 4. And we'll start with chapter 5 and get introduced to Charlotte. Maybe tomorrow. I don't know when I'll be able to read again. Tomorrow's Sunday, and Grandpa has lots of things to do on Sunday. But I appreciate you kids and love you very much, and hope you have a good day. Serve the Lord with joy and gladness, and worship together with your church families, even if you have to do it by virtual church, through the TV and the computer and stuff. Being a part of God's worship is important. It's important to Grandpa, and I hope it's important to you too. We love you. Bye.